So thank you to the Philosophy Sharing Organization as well. Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm going to start actually with a little experiment. So I'd like to ask you all to close your eyes for a moment and picture the letter A. So capital letter, if you prefer, you can picture lowercase a, and just think to yourself, does it have a color? Does any color come to mind? Anything else, maybe texture or something else that you might just immediately pop into your mind that's associated with this letter A? Okay, now you can open your eyes and, whoops, sorry, went one too much. Yeah, and then raise your hand if you have a color association, if a color came into your mind for this letter. Yeah? Yeah, oh wow, quite a few. Okay, now raise your hand if it was red. Wow, all right. Now raise your hand if it was any other color besides red. Wow, okay, really a lot. So this is an example of what we call grapheme color synesthesia. So when a grapheme, which is just a letter or a number, evokes the sense of a color. Okay, and it's often, A tends to be red, but for synesthete, it can be actually any color. And it's very hard to predict what color it would be. So synesthesia is actually very many different things. It's an umbrella term for a variety of experience. And I'm going to first give some examples of different kinds of synesthesia, and then I'll talk a bit more about what we know about synesthesia. So this is an example of days of the week. So maybe some of you, instead of having a letter in a certain color, such as red, your Monday might be red. Or your January might be red, which is often the case. This is another example of a time-space synesthesia combined with a time-color synesthesia. So we might notice in these two examples that besides color, there's also a spatial organization. So if Monday is red, Tuesday orange, Wednesday yellow, Thursday green, and so forth. For the years, the months of the years, this can be also in a spatial organization. Here, it's in the example of a circle, and each month has a specific color. So for a synesthete, July in this case is yellow, and it's also located at the top, somewhere above. Yeah. So this time or sequence spatial form of synesthesia can often have no color associated with it. So I actually have this type of synesthesia. I have absolutely no color association, but I think I would guess that a few of you, at least in the room, have some kind of spatial association when you think of different units of time. So it could be like I mentioned, the weekdays or the years or even centuries if you think about where the ancient Greeks were in terms of space. Can you locate that and compare that to where the future is? So in 2030, for example. So this is an example of how I think about age. So how old people are. So from 0 when you're born all the way up to very old age, around 100 or so, because I had some family members that lived quite that long. And it kind of makes sense, you know, as you grow up and then you get bigger and then things kind of level off. I have also different spatial arrangements for the year, which in my case is not a circle, but it's like a matrix where the months are the rows and the columns are the years. And the current year, it's always in the middle. And as we shift into the next year, it shifts, in my perspective, from right to left. And December and January are quite separated from one another, and this makes planning during that time of year really hard because I always have to shift my focus from December to January. And when the next year starts and it can come into the middle of my perspective, then it's very satisfying and I can kind of be like, oh, okay, everything is in its in order close to each other again. like many synesthetes, I didn't think this was anything special at all. Actually, I was studying, doing my PhD on synesthesia and only realized that this is a form of synesthesia and that I do this as well because I was watching somebody present about this synesthesia. So this happens with grapheme color synesthesia. Often people say, actually a couple of the students I taught this week here at the University of Malta came to me after class and said, wow, I thought everybody does that. And one of them had colors for everything. She had colors for weekdays and sound and people and personality and this kind of thing. And she said, I thought everybody did that. So that can happen as well. Besides space, graphemes or other sequences like weeks or days of the week, months of the year, can have personality. So this is called ordinal linguistic personification or grapheme personification. So each letter of the alphabet or each number or each day of the week will have a gender, has an age, and also has a specific characteristic, like being kind or being jealous or being curious. And you can describe those letters or those numbers or those weekdays almost like you can describe a friend that you know. They have a very specific personality. They even might have a job that they do, like a kind of profession that they have. Another fascinating form of synesthesia is called lexical gustatory synesthesia. This is, in simpler words, tasting words. So words and sounds are evoking taste and smell on the tongue and in the mouth and the nose as you're speaking. So, for example, these are associations of Dutch synesthete, her initials, we call case studies by their initials, so SC. And I had the privilege of studying her during my PhD. So her associations are like this. So apple, the word apple tastes like apple. So food words will always taste like the food words they describe, maybe not surprising. We can imagine what an apple tastes like, but then you also have words like chapel. So chapel sounds like apple, it also tastes like apple. So similar sounding words tend to taste similarly. And then you also have this sort of third level of association or experience in lexical gustatory synesthesia, that things that are semantically related. So the word for swimming to SC tastes like chlorine, probably because of the association developed, learned when the child, in her case, was swimming in the swimming pool, and you smell the chlorine, the bleach, right? So you learn to associate a word like swimming with that smell. So these three levels of association, this is common across this type of synesthesia. So it's very rare, this kind of synesthesia, I think less than 0.2% of the population. But when you find a few of those people, they will often say report similar experiences. And I think it's very interesting in this case because you can almost clearly see how this might have started from development, where the first words we learn as children are usually food words, also color in other cases. But then those concepts start to branch out into other words that you learn that are a bit more abstract, but still in the case of a noun. And then in the case of these semantic associations like swimming, they're even more abstract. So you can see how the food association developed into these more later learned concepts. So for SC, discrete sounds like trigger a taste or a smell. So it can be part of words if you have compound words, or whole words if they're in a unit. It's only familiar language to SC, and I think to most lexical gustatory synesthetes. The synesthetic taste or smell doesn't mix with real taste and smell. So when SC is eating and listening to somebody talk, they're not mixing together, they're co-occurring. And this is also the case with the color. It's usually not that the synesthetic color is mixing with the real color, if you're reading or you see letters and colors, but they somehow coexist simultaneously. It can also be temperature as well, and feelings of like having marbles, for example, in the mouth. Hi, welcome, no worries. And they can often be very unpleasant tastes and smells. So a lot of the lexical gustatory experiences are unpleasant, like sewer tasting things, and not nice, not necessarily nice. Okay, so now I have a video example I'd like to show for you of, this is a sound color synesthete. Her name is Caitlin, and she made this video. She's a musician, and she made this video to illustrate what her synesthesia is like. So she's gonna play the violin, and you're gonna see these flashes of light and form, so different colors, different shapes, in different durations while she's playing. It's about 2-3 minute video. And those colors and those shapes are a representation of what it's like for her, what she experiences when she has this synesthesia. And I think it's a great example because it's so illustrative in video form. So please.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Maria. I'm a violinist and neuroscientist, and I have auditory synesthesia. So I hear sounds as colors, and I like to use it with my music. I've currently been trying to combine my synesthesia with my own solo remixes and original arrangements to make something really special.
Okay. So I've shown you a lot of examples of synesthesia. So what is synesthesia? Like I mentioned, it's an umbrella term for a variety of different experiences. And it's stemming, the word synesthesia is stemming from the Greek, which I won't attempt and butcher for you, but it's translated loosely as together plus sensation, so joint sensation. In research, for research purposes, we additionally define synesthesia to be consistent over time. So if your A is red, so a lot of you raised your hands for that you can imagine A is a certain color, but what would distinguish you as a synesthete would be how consistent the color is over time. So if I gave you a color picker on the computer, and there's, I think, 16 million colors in there, and I made it really hard for you to remember what color you picked for every letter of the alphabet, or every number, or every word, or something like this, and then I surprise tested you even a year or more later, that you would give me almost the exact same colors, because you don't do it from remembering like in a heuristic way, like you're trying to remember some pattern. It just comes naturally to you if you're a synesthete, because the color, you know exactly what the color should be. For research purposes, yeah, this is sort of necessary, this consistency aspect, because otherwise it makes it very hard to develop clever little tests so that we can see what's going on, let's say, in the brain of synesthetes and et cetera. There are cases of genuine synesthesia where the synesthetic experience changes over time, but these are just unfortunately usually left out of the research. It's also automatic. So when I ask you what color A is, you don't have to think about it. It's not a mental imagery. It might be in your mind's eye, meaning that you don't see the color out external to you, like a veridical color, but you shouldn't have to work for the color, the synesthetic color, or the synesthetic taste in the case of SC. And it's perceptual in nature. And so this one is this criterion is a little bit tricky, because like I said, sometimes it can be more of a mental experience, but it's still having a color nature to it. And sometimes it can be really strong, just like a veridical color that you see outside. It's for developmental synesthesia, present since early childhood. So usually synesthetes can't remember ever not having their synesthetic experiences. It's to them a part of their whole life, and it just, those associations, those experiences, they belong together, and they can't remember ever not having it. It tends to run in families. So if you have a form of synesthesia, it's very likely that somebody else in your immediate family has it as well, like a mother or a brother, or even a cousin perhaps. But what's really interesting is that it's not the type of synesthesia that runs in families, it's the trait itself. So if your mother has grapheme color synesthesia, you don't necessarily, you're not more likely to develop that type, grapheme color. You might develop a different type. And this points towards different developmental origins of this synesthesia. About the environmental, there's some environmental influence as well that's really clear. So for example, we don't learn that A is red without first learning what A is, right? So language is clearly learned. And language is one of the most common inducers of synesthesia. So we know, even though it's running in families and there seems to be a genetic component, there has to be this large environmental component as well. So it seems to be an interaction going on between the genes and the environment in synesthesia. And I think really importantly and crucially, it's not a disorder. It's not related to brain damage or disease, or there's nothing wrong with synesthetes. And I think for me, this is really the crucial characteristic of it that makes it so interesting to study, because there's nothing wrong with the brain of a synesthete. If anything, they might have slightly better than average memories. It sometimes does co-occur with other conditions such as savantism, people who have exceptional memories, or autism, but it doesn't mean just because you have synesthesia that you have one of those conditions. So in the early 2000s, synesthesia research got a bit more popular. So it's been known for a while, since, at least in the published literature, since the late 1800s. But in the early 2000s, in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, synesthesia research had a bit of a revival. And a lot of the work went into devising clever little tests ways that we can prove that the synesthetic experience is a real phenomenon, and it's not these synesthetes. They're telling us the truth, and we should believe them, and they're not just imagining their experiences. They're not just having an overactive or vivid imagination. So these tests were things like the consistency tests I mentioned briefly about picking colors, lots of colors for different graphemes and other inducing types of stimuli, and then surprise testing them later on. And if you give the same test to some people without synesthesia, they really do badly. They can't remember these associations very well, even if you tell them you're going to test them again. It's actually really hard. So cognitive psychologists use other tests of memory. So when things are congruent in your synesthetic colors or other associations, that you tend to remember them better. And then again, compared to a group of synesthetes who don't have those experiences, those control participants usually do worse. Also, tests of attention and detection of stimuli. And I think for me, what's been the most fascinating has been the brain imaging studies, which is my field as well. So what happens in the brain of synesthetes? And I will give some examples of that today. So we've studied a lot about synesthesia. Basically, the field has come to the conclusion that it is a real phenomenon. It's not related to this overactive imaginations. And there is a perceptual component to synesthesia, so the synesthetic experience that is beyond just vivid mental imagery. And for me, synesthesia is part of the natural variation in the human condition, right? So we are all different. Although we have many things in common, we are all unique individuals, and it does make sense that just like some people are born colorblind and other people are born with exceptional memories, some of us are born with these additional connections and ability to form associations and see connections in things that others don't. So this is a picture of the University of Malta more than 20 years ago. There's me. And I wanted to put this picture because I wanted to share a little bit about my journey of how I got here today. So 23 years ago, I was an exchange student here at the University of Malta for a year from the United States. I was a philosophy student back then, and I was fascinated by consciousness, and I took as many classes as I could about theory of mind and also epistemology. And at some point in one of my papers I was writing for school, I discovered for myself synesthesia. I came across it in some literature I was reading. And for me, it was like a sort of epiphany moment, because I thought, wow, here's an example of this amazing phenomenon. If this is really a real thing, here we have proof that we don't all experience the world in the same way, right? And it's not related to a disorder, like I mentioned, because of course we know of cases like psychosis or schizophrenia or hallucinations, or in neuropsychology, right, when you have brain damage, we know of all sorts of phenomena like this, but you can always say, well, you know, something's wrong, right? Something's wrong with their brains in that case. But with synesthesia, you can't say that. Here we have, we don't even have a word for this in English, to be honest. We don't have a word for a condition that doesn't have a negative connotation to it. I've been struggling to find a word for this. Some of my colleagues call it divergent perception, because it's different than the usual, but it's different in a generally positive way, whereas in psychology, we most often think about different in a negative way. So for me, this synesthesia, discovering synesthesia for myself, led to all sorts of philosophical questions, like, do we all experience the same world? What's the nature of a sensory modality? If, for example, vision can have a smell, and a smell can have a touch, and a sound can have a color, right? What does that mean about the nature or the quality of the different sensory modalities? Can we even say anything about that anymore? How does the brain construct the synesthetic experience? And does it have implications for theories of consciousness, right? So if we can understand how the brain constructs the synesthetic experience, can we also use that to in a more general case, how does the brain construct consciousness more generally? So I was fascinated by this, and I went on to study cognitive neuroscience. So as much as I loved philosophy and I loved thinking about these ideas, I really wanted to know more about the brain. I thought we must know some of these answers, and I decided to do more empirical work. So 20 years later, more than 20 years later, yeah, I've done that. Now I'm a cognitive neuroscientist for 20 years. And there's one concept that is crucial and that I would like to share with you now that I've learned over these 20 years. And that's the fact that perception is a construction, not a reflection of reality. And so I don't know if I was just naive growing up or if it just is implicit in our culture, but I had assumed that I see the world as it really is. I never really discussed this with anybody. I just assumed that to be the case. And again, it was an epiphany moment to realize that that's actually not necessarily true. This is, not necessarily a modern idea, as we know from Kant, the Copernican revolution, which we taught about this week also in class. Right? So Kant's categories of mind are very reminiscent of this, right? We enter the world with these faculties that we impose and we project onto the world to be able to understand it. They're inherent in our experience and in our ability to be in the world. We can't even conceive or comprehend the world without doing it through this sort of filter or these categories of mind. And this is very reminiscent of modern neuroscience. So, it's not just an old philosophical idea. It's also, I would say, the crucial concept that we've come to understand as a neuroscientist. And so I sometimes take it for granted now, as 20 years ago and more than that when I was a child, that I saw the world as it really is. I sometimes now do the opposite, where I, as a neuroscientist, assume that everybody knows this. So I want to give a couple quick examples that don't have to do with synesthesia, but that illustrate this point a little bit. So the first is this checker shadow illusion. So what you see here is a chessboard with light and dark squares. And you see this cylinder, this green cylinder, sort of to the right side, and it's casting a shadow, right, on part of the chessboard. So I want you to notice the squares labeled A and B, and their colors. So A is square A, not the letter A, the square A. What color is it? Dark, light, dark, yeah. And B? Light? Yeah? Okay. So actually, they're the exact same color. Maybe some of you have seen this before. So how can that be the case? The wavelengths of light of the squares A and B are actually identical. But your brain isn't just only processing those wavelengths of light, like a camera would. It's doing something else. It's also processing the context of the checkerboard. So, and I promise you it's not a trick of the computer or something. So we know that shadows cast a shadow will make an object darker. So the cylinder is casting a shadow, and it's making that it should make the square B darker, but at the same time, the B is surrounded by a darker, it's in the position that should be a light gray square, right? So your brain is also paying attention to the pattern of the checkerboard. So B should be a light square following the pattern, right? So your brain is basically compensating for that shadow cast there and making B lighter. it's solving the problem, right? It's sort of solving the problem of the context instead of just passively absorbing the wavelengths of light. Okay, so I have another quick example. This is called a Mooney image in cognitive neuroscience. So it's a degraded image of a photograph. So I want you to think for yourself, don't say it out loud, because if you do see, if you see an object or anything in there in the picture, don't say it out loud, just think for yourself in case you, don't ruin it for your neighbor, just in case. But just take a look at the photo and see if you can find any familiar objects or, things like animals or people or faces or anything, just a, typical photograph. Okay, now I'm going to show you the real photograph. It's a cheetah. I think it's a cheetah or a leopard. I think it's a cheetah. I forget which one has the open spots and which one has the closed spots. My daughter would know this. I don't know this. Now I'm going to show you the degraded photo again. And now you can see it, right? Yeah. And what's really kind of cool about these Mooney images is once you see it, you can't unsee it. So you can only use the stimulus once in an experiment with people, because once you see it, so even if I show you this picture, maybe even like a year from now, you probably would recognize the cheetah, I would guess. So this is another example of how your brain uses the prior information to fill in the context of what was otherwise ambiguous in this case. So it's your brain doing its job, it's constructing and it's predicting your experience. Okay. So what does synesthesia reveal about the mind-brain relationship? So I gave a couple of quick examples and also synesthesia, all illustrating this concept of perception as an active and constructive process. And like I said, this idea stems back to Kant, and it's actually directly through Helmholtz gave way to the current predictive processing framework in neuroscience. So this is a very influential and very popular current theory of brain mechanisms, basically. That what the brain does is it inherently generates models of the world and tries to predict what you're going to experience. And those predictions are the subjective experience. So what's exactly going on in the brain of synesthetes specifically? I'm going to give you a few examples from neuroscience, my favorite examples. I'm going to try, and I tried to make them as accessible and as simple as possible for everybody to understand, because to me it's very fascinating what we do know about, the neural correlates of the synesthetic experience. But first, we can't talk about synesthesia without mentioning qualia. So if you guys come to philosophy talks, often probably you're familiar with this term. It means the properties or the content of subjective experience. So colors are a great example, sounds, tastes, smells, tactile feelings, pain, hunger, also hallucinations. And I like this little image because the brain in the vat, which was termed by, I think, Hilary Putnam in his book in the 80s, because it gives a representation of what if you were just a brain in a vat hooked up to a supercomputer and it was feeding you all the external stimulation, and you had no idea that you didn't have a body. You would still be having qualia. You could still be having the qualia like, I'm hungry, even though you don't have a stomach. So synesthesia is, quintessentially fascinating because of the qualia that's associated and reported by synesthetes. And so it gives us an opportunity to study qualia in the lab, but also in something like an MRI scanner or with other fancy devices where we measure the brains of synesthetes. And what is so special about synesthesia is that it's a case where you have input coming in, for example, the normal input of sound, but the synesthetic experience, for instance, color, there is no external stimulation associated with the color. So even though the person is having a color experience, there's no input, the wavelengths of light hitting their eye, it's not there, it's missing. So we can ask, how does the brain generate that color experience, right? So it's actually, they're having an additional association, as you can see in this example. You have the sound, so if this is an example of Caitlin, who we saw in the video playing the violin. So for most of us, we would just hear the violin, but Caitlin, she also hears the violin, but she has this additional color experience. And that's exactly, for cognitive neuroscience, a fascinating and super interesting opportunity to ask, how is that color experience constructed in the absence of color? Okay? And what we know is that this is the region that normally processes sounds. This is the brain, this is a human brain. So I made it a little cartoony here. So apologies to anyone who is, more of a neuroscience. But generally you hear a sound and it comes into your auditory cortex. But for synesthetes, we also see activation of the brain's color region and visual cortex activated. So if you don't have a synesthetic experience, you wouldn't have that color activation. And so for a lot of people, that finding alone of just color activation in the presence of synesthetic color is already proof that this is a perceptual and real phenomenon, synesthesia. And then additionally, I'd like to mention another brain region that we see very crucial to the synesthetic experience. It's more on the top of the brain. It's called the parietal lobe. And this part of the brain seems to be crucial for binding these two sensory modalities together. So in synesthetes, irrespective of what kind of synesthesia they have, you almost always see this parietal activation because it has to do with attention, attending to the stimuli, the sound, and it's important for connecting these two modalities together. So just to give one other example, for the lexical gustatory case of XSC, when she hears the word chapel, we also see auditory cortex activation for the sound. But in her case, the synesthetic experience isn't a color, it's a taste. So we should see in her brain the primary region of taste in the brain activated for the synesthesia, and that's exactly what we find. And as I mentioned, we also then find this parietal lobe activation. Now, if I show SC instead of auditory words like sound, I give her written words to look at while she's in the scanner, you would see not the auditory cortex, but the visual cortex activated with the taste region. So the stimuli coming in, that's the same for all of us, but this additional synesthetic experience, you can locate it in the brain based on the specific qualia that the person is having. Quail. Okay. This parietal region is also really important. If you can do this thing called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, and it's giving short little pulses of electricity to a small portion of the brain. It sounds a little bit crazy, but it's safe, and it's used in experiments to see what's the role, the causal role of certain areas. And if you apply that technique to this parietal lobe here, you also break the association between the inducing stimulus and the synesthetic qualia. So it seems to be also crucial for, like I said, this binding of these two sensory modalities. Okay, so that's synesthesia in general, but we can also ask a bit more in depth about the experience of synesthetes. So now we're just looking at only a group of synesthetes and asking them about what is your qualia like? What's the nature of your qualia? Where is the color, for example, located? And that's a common question that we ask. And then we, based on their answers, we can categorize them or use it as a continuous measure. A common categorization that we use for synesthesia, for grapheme color synesthesia, which is the most common and studied type in the research, is this associator versus projector type. And associators will tell you that the synesthetic experience, the color, isn't located outside of them, outside of their body. It's located, usually they will say, and it's internal or it's in my mind. I know that it's not out there in the world. Whereas projector type of synesthetes will tell you that I see the color outside, it's there, it's on the page, or it's nearby. It's more like a veridical color experience. Now, some people argue that actually only projectors are real synesthetes, but I'm not one of those. But yeah, what's interesting here is to use this kind of classification, these individual differences between the synesthetes themselves, to further look in the brain about how these differences in the experience are related to different patterns of brain activation or connectivity between regions. So what do we find when we do that? So I'll start with a projector case. So here's the brain of a projector, and then if they're reading, in this case we show them letters visually on the screen, they're lying in the MRI scanner. So we see the visual brain activation. There's a region in your visual cortex called the visual word form area. So it's always activated when you see visual words. And then what happens is the information flows from the visual word form area that's represented by that book into that color region. These are the same regions I showed you before, similar regions. And then what happens is that information goes up to that parietal lobe region. So we not only know where in the brain this information is being processed, but also how the information is being passed through these regions over time while they're seeing the letter. In the projector case, this information is going first all the way through visual cortex and only then up to what we call these higher order areas in parietal cortex. Now I'll contrast this with the associator case. So we have the same brain regions, but different flow of information. So they see the grapheme 7 in this case. First, the information goes to the parietal lobe. It doesn't go straight to the brain's color region. It goes first up to a higher order area, and only then does it come back down to the brain's color region. And actually, even it's a bidirectional connectivity button. So we already see differences in the flow of information, and it makes a lot of sense based on what we know about the qualia of these individual synesthetes. Like I mentioned, the projector type of synesthesia is more like a veridical color. The color is located out in the external world. And we see in the case of the projectors that the information is also moving faster through visual cortex. We also know this from other studies. Than in the case of the associators, where it's going more, it's kind of slower. It's actually slower to reach the brain's color region. And we know from other studies of looking at the connectivity between regions, so the actual physical fibers of the neurons between the brain, where the book and the color is in the brain, the thicker those connections are between that region is also related to how strong of a projector synesthete you are. So the more direct, like you can think about it like thicker cables connecting these two regions in visual cortex, the more likely that you have a projector type of synesthesia. So your visual cortex is like the synesthetic experience is more related to this early and fast and visual cortical activation and connectivity than in the case of the associator synesthete. that was a lot of information, a crash course in neuroscience maybe. I hope it was understandable. It's my last example of neuroscience for you today. Actually, it's even more complicated or complex than what I described. So I described this projector-associator distinction, and that's already been very helpful for us as researchers. But if you really ask individual synesthetes what is their qualia like, you don't just get these simple categories. You get very different answers. So in the top, I don't know if you can see this, it's maybe a little bit blurry, but in the top row, the girl and the two girls, the same girl, but on the top, she's having a projector type of synesthesia, but in the one case, the color is located on the page. On the right-hand side, she's actually locating the color somewhere halfway between the page and her own body. So this happens sometimes, they describe this. And the bottom three are examples, different kind of examples of what we would term an associator. So they would tell you that the color is in their mind, which is represented by the thought bubble there. But you get different descriptions. Sometimes the color takes the shape of the letter, the shape of the number. Sometimes it's just the color is just there, but it's not having the shape of the letter itself. And sometimes the color just takes over the whole visual field. And there's actually even a category of synesthetes, well, some would argue, are they really synesthetes? They will always tell you that the letter has a color, but they will say, I have no color experience whatsoever. I just know it has a color. It's just like a knowing it belongs to red, but there's no redness in my mind. There's no redness out there in the world. I just have this very strong feeling that A is red. And we call them K-N-O-W, no associators. And so it's also been, a little bit of a debate lately, like, these people, are they associators? Are they synesthetes? What should we do with them? There's also some people who believe that you can have aphantasia, which is no mental imagery. Some people have no ability to visualize something in their mind. That you can have aphantasia and also have synesthesia. And so it makes sense if you think about this no associator category. So I don't have neuroimaging data on all these cases. I'm just using this to illustrate that were we to probe even further into these individual differences, I think we would also be able to find very interesting differences in the brains, maybe even at the individual level, related to their different qualia. Okay? So we're not there yet. We're not at the individual level yet, but I think that, we could potentially be there one day. Okay, so synesthesia, everything I've told you up till now is a neural correlate of consciousness, right? These are just correlations of brain activation, brain connectivity with certain subjective experiences, certain qualia of synesthetes. But we can't say if the synesthetic experience is a cause or a result of these brain differences when we study developmental synesthetes, because they've had it their whole life. So we don't know, right? We don't know if what's causing what. It's a chicken and egg situation. And as I mentioned before, there's this environmental component to synesthesia. You can even sometimes find cases where certain letters or number, the color for them, are traced back to refrigerator magnets that you had as a child or the learning aids that you had in your classroom wall. It's not always the case, but it can be done. And so people have asked, can you train synesthesia? Can you develop it? Can you take an adult person without any kind of synesthesia and see if they will develop a synesthetic experience? So this has actually been done, some research on this, trying to train people to develop synesthesia for more than 100 years. Not that it's been the most popular line of research, but there have been papers published on this from early 1900s. It's always done through some form of associative learning. So that's just taking one stimulus like the letter A or a certain sound and pairing it consistently with a color, for example, or a light source. And if you repeat this pairing over and over and over and over again, the hope is that the person starts to expect or associate or develop such a strong association link between these two items that they see it when it's not there. Once you take it away again, the color, that it will remain in their mind's eye. It hasn't been super successful until recently, actually, and as you can imagine, most of the research has been focused on the phenomenology of the trained synesthesia. And now we're also starting to focus a bit on, are there cognitive benefits to developing synesthesia? For example, when you're learning to read or add numbers, et cetera, et cetera. So part of the research that I did during my PhD was about this training synesthesia. So what we did was we took adult people who didn't have synesthesia, and we gave them books to read with colored letters. So I did this in different ways. I started with only 4 very high frequency colors, 4 high frequency letters, and paired them with 4 high frequency colors. This is an example, a more recent example, where I have something like half the alphabet in color and the other half of the alphabet is always left in black, because then we can compare the letters that were black and the letters that were in color in the books, and we can compare then the trained and untrained letter associations. And then we asked the question, okay, what happens after you read these books? So they choose what they read. I like this method of reading because they see the letter, let's say, is A red in this example? I think it's almost always red with me. A is red. They see the red A. If they read a novel 100,000 words, they see it maybe, 10,000 times. It's a lot of exposure to the A in the red, right? That's what's really beneficial about the reading in color. So they choose what they read. They're not told to remember anything. They go home, they read these books. I used to print them for them. Nowadays we do it, they read on the computer, on their phones. They do it for several weeks, sometimes months. And then we test them before and after. And we ask, when I show you now the black letter A, do you have any kind of color experience? Is there an expectation of the color? Do you see the color? Is it a mental color? Do you project it into the world? Do you know that there's a color? There's no color whatsoever. Just to summarize in short, what I find is about 1/2 to 2/3 of the participants will report having some kind of color experience. So like for A, they report that it has a bit of a redness to it. They've all been on the associator type, in the associator range, not in the projector range. So another group at the University of Sussex, they did a more demanding and cognitively difficult training study where they didn't just go home and read books. The participants came into the lab and they did all sorts of computer tasks with memory training and associating letters with letters with colors. And they found, after I think they did it for 9 weeks, they found that almost all of their participants were reporting very strong color phenomenology at the end of training. But these associations, once you stop the training, they don't last. They generally are gone. They tested, like the Sussex group tested them about 3 months later, and most of the interesting effects, like the phenomenology, were gone. I put my participants in the MRI scanner. I guess that wasn't my last example of the brain. Sorry, I forgot about this. But what we found was that after training, and I showed the participants the black letter A, the degree of how strong, so this associator projector dimension is like a number, a continuous number. We base it on a questionnaire, so it's a range. So how strong of an associator they were correlated with how much activation there was in the brain's color region while they were viewing the black letters. So it's like a signal. It could be an expectation of red. It could be directly related to the subjective experience of red. But for me, this was a really interesting finding. So in the University of Sussex group, they also they didn't do MRI imaging, but what they did was they tested how strongly activated the visual cortex was of their trainees. And after the synesthesia training, they were more activated. They were highly activated, like a synesthete's brain would be. So there is some overlap. We find some overlap between the developmental case of synesthesia and these trainees. But of course, we're not at the point where we can say it's exactly the same. And we know that, like I mentioned, it's extinguished after some time. Okay. Oh yeah, and the parietal region was also involved here. So I started with the question about, do we all experience the same world? And I started asking myself this many, many years ago, and I have to come to the answer for myself that no, right? I don't think that we all experience the same world. There might be some overlap, but to a large degree, I think that we have an individual experience. So synesthesia is my favorite example, but there are other ways of studying this, such as through sensory substitution or things like bistable perception, altered states of consciousness. These problems are, for cognitive neuroscientists, concrete, measurable, and they're not so abstract anymore. So we have a lot of cases of the same input coming in, the same external input coming in, giving rise to different experiences, different qualia. And for me, synesthesia has been a window into the fundamental privacy of consciousness. And another very interesting question that it raised that I started with was about the nature of sensory modalities. So I mentioned, what does it say about sound or vision or taste when they can mix, right? What is unique about those qualities? Are there maybe hidden connections between these modalities that we're usually unaware of? I wonder that sometimes. Maybe there is something independent from our minds that's out there in the world, but we don't normally have access to it. Maybe synesthetes actually do. I'm not really sure. These are images of, these are metal plates with sand on them, and each plate is vibrating at a different auditory frequency. And what you see here is that these different auditory frequencies give rise to different visual patterns of the sand. So when you look at auditory information in this way, you can start to see that there's an inherent spatial dimension. There's a spatial quality to auditory information. And I think this is maybe also hinting towards this question about whether there's a deeper connection between modalities that we're missing. Anil Seth, who is a neuroscientist and philosopher, would say that reality is a controlled hallucination. So, while we are creating and predicting and projecting our experience onto the world, it is generally in a controlled way. There must be some connection to external reality, right? Although it is inherently a hallucination. And Seth, he also defines what he calls the real problem of consciousness, and he contrasts that to the hard problem. And for him, the real problem of consciousness is to explain, predict, and control phenomenological experience in terms of the brain and the body. And so Thomas Nagel, in his seminal paper, he described that the closer we are to sharing experience, such as quality, the more we are able to understand each other's and imagine each other's experiences, right? And so for me, the key to this riddle of consciousness has been in large part by understanding how synesthetes, how their qualia arises from their brain function and structure. So instead of what it's like to be a bat, I'd like to ask what it's like to be a synesthete. And yeah, that's it. Thank you for your attention. So.